A Roman emperor rewarded a killer with something more valuable than gold: a new life. Locusta of Gaul had mastered the art of poisoning, and under Nero, that talent made her useful enough to escape punishment and receive wealth, land, and protection. But when Nero fell, the same woman who had once served the imperial court became a symbol of everything Rome wanted to condemn. Her fate was sealed by the very power that had once protected her. But Roman history is filled with people whose fortunes changed the moment political power changed hands. The 22 cases that follow reveal murders that were rewarded, concealed, manipulated, and eventually punished for reasons that were often more political than criminal. So, before we examine the victims, we begin with the woman who made poison an instrument of power. The garden lies on the Palatine Hill, in the shadow of Nero's growing palace, and in the year 54 AD, it holds a woman whose name Roman historians could not agree how to spell: Locusta or Lucusta or Lucilla, but whose trade none of them doubted. She grows plants here, hemlock perhaps, henbane, deadly nightshade, its berries dark and sweet enough to fool a child. We do not know exactly which poisons she cultivated, only that by the time Agrippina the Younger sought her out, Locusta already had a reputation, and more strikingly, a criminal record. She had been convicted of poisoning once before. She was, by the time the Empress came calling, in prison. That detail alone should give us pause. Rome executed people for far less. Yet here was a convicted poisoner, still alive, still apparently reachable by the most powerful woman in the empire. Agrippina wanted her husband dead, the Emperor Clodius, and she wanted it done in a way that would not announce itself. Tacitus and Suetonius, our two main sources, both name Locusta as the hand behind the poisoned mushroom dish served to Clodius in October of 54 AD. Some accounts say the first dose failed to kill him quickly enough, and that Locusta was summoned again to prepare a second attempt, delivered through a feather used to induce vomiting. A feather coated, they claim, in something far more lethal than relief. Clodius died. Nero became emperor at 16, and Locusta, instead of returning to her cell, was given something remarkable: protection. 4 years later, Nero had his own use for her. His stepbrother Britannicus, Claudius's actual son, a rival with a stronger claim to the throne than Nero himself, dined at the palace and never left the table the same man. Ancient writers describe a poison Locusta brewed that acted too slowly for Nero's taste, prompting him to strike her personally, then demand a faster formula. She tested it, they say, on a goat, then a pig, refining the dose until death came within moments. Britannicus collapsed at dinner in front of guests, and Nero calmly explained it away as an epileptic seizure. No one investigated further. No one, it seems, dared to. What follows is where the historical record becomes genuinely strange. Nero did not punish Locusta for regicide. He rewarded her with a formal pardon, with vast estates, and, according to some accounts, with pupils. Young Romans sent to learn the art of poison directly from her hand. For over a decade, a woman who had killed at least 2 members of the imperial family under 2 different circumstances operated not in hiding, but in something resembling institutional favor. Then, in 68 AD, Nero fell. His successor, Galba, moved quickly to erase the symbols of the old regime, and Locusta was among those dragged through the streets in chains before her execution. The historian Cassius Dio, writing over a century later, adds a detail no other source confirms: that she was paraded publicly as spectacle before she died, a final humiliation for services once quietly celebrated. So, which version of Locusta was real? The criminal Rome once imprisoned, or the artisan it later funded? Was she a monster the empire simply found useful, or a woman who understood, better than anyone, that in Nero's Rome, the line between crime and statecraft depended entirely on who benefited? The sources that describe her were written by men who despised the emperors she served, which leaves us wondering how much of her story survives intact and how much was shaped to make her monstrous. Somewhere between the poisoned mushrooms and the public execution, the real Locusta, her methods, her motives, even her exact fate, disappears into the gap in history left behind. A century and a half after Locusta's ashes were scattered by a mob that wanted her erased, another figure would trouble Rome's sense of order, not with poison, but with something almost worse: charm. By 205 AD, under the reign of Septimius Severus, the roads south of Rome toward Brundisium had become unsafe in a way no one could quite explain. Merchants vanished. Wagons were stopped in daylight. And yet strangely, almost no one died. The man responsible for this campaign of vanishing goods and untouched lives was known only by a name that seems, in hindsight, almost too fitting to be real: Bulla Felix. Bulla, the protective amulet worn by freeborn Roman boys, a charm against misfortune. Felix, lucky, fortunate, blessed. Whether he chose the name himself or earned it from those he robbed, no source tells us. What we do know is that for 2 years, he made fools of an empire that considered itself invincible. The historian Cassius Dio, writing not long after the events, describes Bulla commanding a band of roughly 600 men, a number that itself raises questions. 600 men do not simply appear from nowhere, nor do they vanish into the Italian countryside without local knowledge, local shelter, local silence. Who were they? Dio tells us they included escaped slaves and men who'd fled harsh treatment or debt, drawn to Bulla's operation the way desperate men are drawn to anyone who seems to offer order amid chaos. But 600 is a small army, not a gang, and Rome had legions. Why then could it not simply crush him? Here, the record turns strange in a way that feels less like banditry and more like theater. Bulla, according to Dio, would disguise himself as a magistrate. Dressing in the robes of Roman authority, complete with attendants, and approach the very soldiers sent to hunt him. In this disguise, he would supposedly interrogate captured travelers, learn what goods they carried, then release them, only to have his men rob them properly once they'd continued on their way. It is a detail almost too clever to believe, and yet Dio, a Roman senator writing with access to official accounts, reports it without hesitation. If true, it means Bulla did not simply evade the Roman state, he impersonated it, wore its face, used its own machinery of trust against it. And then there is the matter of his mercy, which unsettles the story further. Ancient banditry was rarely gentle. Yet multiple accounts agree that Bulla split his plunder with something resembling fairness among his men, that he spared the lives of those he robbed, and that when he captured artisans and craftsmen, a smith, a metal worker, he would keep them only long enough to use their skills before releasing them, sometimes even paying them for their trouble. Why would a man hunted by the full weight of the Roman military choose restraint? Was this genuine principle a code he held to for reasons lost to us, or was it calculation? A bandit who understood that terror invites overwhelming force, while restraint, oddly, might buy him the one thing he needed most: a population unwilling to inform on him. Severus, we're told, grew furious at his own army's failure. An emperor who had fought wars on multiple frontiers could not seem to locate one man in his own Italian heartland. Dio records the emperor sending an entire cohort of cavalry after Bulla, achieving nothing. The bandit, who could disappear into the landscape of his own countryside, continued operating, it seems, less like a fugitive and more like a shadow government, untouchable because he understood the terrain, the people, and perhaps the loyalties better than Rome itself did. His downfall, when it came, arrived through the oldest vulnerability there is. Bulla had formed a relationship with another man's wife. Some accounts call her a mistress, others a lover drawn into his confidence. And it was this woman, whether through jealousy, fear, or a bargain struck with authorities, who is said to have betrayed his location. Roman soldiers under the praetorian prefect Oppianicus finally captured him, reportedly finding him asleep in a cave, undone not by force but by trust, misplaced in exactly the way his victims had once misplaced theirs in him. Brought before Oppianicus, Bulla was asked, according to Dio, why he had turned to banditry. His reported answer has survived for 18 centuries precisely because of what it implies. Why are you a prefect? A single sentence, if genuine, that reframes the entire chapter, not as the story of a criminal defying the law, but as one man's accusation that Rome's officials were bandits too, simply ones with imperial permission. Bulla was sent to the beasts in the arena. His followers were said to be so numerous that Dio claimed Italy seemed emptied of its slave population in the aftermath. But how much of this is history, and how much is legend accreting around a name too poetic to resist? Did one man truly command 600 followers and impersonate Roman magistrates for 2 full years? Or did an anonymous wave of banditry along the southern roads eventually collapse into a single, memorable figure? Lucky, charmed, worth telling stories about? Dio wrote as a contemporary, which lends the account weight. Yet he also wrote for readers hungry for a bandit clever enough to humiliate an emperor. Where the man ends and the myth begins is a line that, like so much of Rome's underworld, was never meant to be found. Why are you a prefect? Bulla's question lingers over Roman history like an accusation that never quite got answered. The suggestion that the line between bandit and official was, in the end, a matter of paperwork rather than principle. A century and a half before Bulla ever raised that question in a cave in southern Italy, one Roman governor answered it in advance, and did so not with a single sentence, but with 4 years of systematic theft so thorough that the courtroom speeches written to prosecute him still survive as the single longest body of accusatory text to come down to us from the ancient world. The island is Sicily, the years 73 to 71 BC, and the man is Gaius Verres, governor of a province that Rome had held for over a century and treated, by then, as something between a granary and a piggy bank. Sicily fed Rome. Its temples held centuries of accumulated wealth, bronze statues, gold-inlaid ivory, cult objects so old that some were already ancient when the Romans first arrived. Verres arrived as governor in 73 BC with, by most accounts, a reputation already tarnished by corruption in earlier postings. What he did in Sicily, though, went beyond the ordinary graft expected of provincial administrators. He did not merely tax the province. He appears to have catalogued its beauty and taken it, piece by piece, as though the office of governor came with an inventory list and a standing order to empty it. The evidence for this comes almost entirely from one source, and that source itself deserves scrutiny. A young lawyer named Marcus Tullius Cicero, hired by Sicilian communities desperate enough to take the extraordinary step of prosecuting a former governor, a move that risked retaliation from the entire class of Roman nobility Verres belonged to. Cicero's speeches against Verres, known collectively as the Verrine Orations, describe a governor who seized privately owned artworks from Sicilian citizens under invented pretexts, who stripped temples of statues sacred enough that their removal was remembered as sacrilege generations later, and who allegedly extorted grain merchants and ship captains through manufactured legal charges, pocketing the settlements paid to make the charges disappear. One story recounted by Cicero describes Verres coveting a set of silver cups so intensely that he had a local man's house searched and the cups confiscated outright. No purchase, no pretense of a transaction. Theft conducted with the full authority of Roman law standing behind it. But here is where the case becomes something more than a simple story of a greedy official, because Cicero was not a neutral chronicler. He was the prosecutor, paid and motivated to make Verres look as monstrous as possible, delivering speeches meant to sway a Roman jury and, not incidentally, to launch Cicero's own political career at the expense of a powerful man's ruin. Verres, for his part, never mounted a full defense. He fled into exile after the first phase of the trial, before Cicero had even delivered the bulk of his prepared accusations, a decision that looks, on its face, like an admission of guilt. Yet it may equally have been a calculation. Verres's defense attorney was Quintus Hortensius, the most celebrated orator in Rome before Cicero eclipsed him, and even Hortensius may have concluded the evidence, or the political climate, could not be overcome. We are left then with a case where the prosecution's version is nearly the entire surviving record, and the defense's version barely exists at all. What exactly did Verres take, and how much of Cicero's catalogue reflects reality rather than rhetorical excess designed to horrify a Roman jury already primed to resent provincial corruption? Cicero claims Verres extracted roughly 40 million sesterces from Sicily over 4 years, an almost incomprehensible sum, one that some modern historians view with suspicion, wondering whether the true figure was inflated for effect, and what became of the objects themselves, the statues, the cups, the temple treasures, after Verres fled to Massilia, modern-day Marseille, where he is said to have lived out the remainder of his life in exile. Did he take his stolen collection with him? Did it scatter across the Mediterranean art trade of the 1st century BC, sold and resold until its origins were forgotten? No inventory survives. No cash has ever been recovered bearing his name. There is a final, darker footnote that Sicily's own historical memory attaches to Verres' death. Killed, according to later tradition, on the orders of Mark Antony during the proscriptions of 43 BC, not for his crimes in Sicily, 3 decades gone, but reportedly because Antony wanted the same Corinthian bronzes Verres had once stolen and still refused, even in exile, to surrender. If true, it means the man who built his fortune, stripping temples and private homes of their treasures, may have died for the treasures themselves, hoarded to the very end. It is a fittingly circular ending, except that, like so much of his story, we cannot fully verify it, only repeat it as Roman tradition chose to remember him. Was Verres uniquely monstrous among provincial governors, or simply the one unlucky enough to be prosecuted by the greatest orator Rome ever produced? Somewhere between Cicero's speeches and Sicily's empty temple pedestals, the true scale of what Verres took and what became of it remains an open ledger, its final sum never quite settled. Cicero would spend nearly 4 decades in Roman courtrooms, and Verres was far from the only defendant whose name survives mainly because of what Cicero said about him. A decade after the Verrine orations made his career, Cicero stood again before a Roman jury, this time not prosecuting, but defending a man accused of a crime almost too tangled to summarize, in a case that would require Cicero to unravel, or perhaps construct, one of the most convoluted poisoning sagas the Republic ever produced. At its center was a man named Statius Albius Oppianicus, from the town of Larinum in southern Italy, whose life, by the time Cicero finished describing it in 66 BC, contained so many alleged murders that even ancient audiences seem to have struggled to keep the body count straight. The speech is called Pro Cluentio, for Cluentius, and it survives completely, giving us something rare, not a fragment, but Cicero's full architecture of accusation against a man already dead by the time the speech was delivered. Oppianicus had died in 72 BC, 4 years before this trial, which makes the case itself strange from the outset. Cicero was not defending a client accused of Oppianicus's crimes exactly. He was defending Aulus Cluentius Habitus, Oppianicus's own stepson, who stood accused of poisoning Oppianicus years earlier, a charge that required Cicero to spend the bulk of his defense not proving Cluentius innocent of poisoning, but proving that Oppianicus deserved it, cataloging a decade of alleged murders attributed to the dead man in order to make his death look less like a crime and more like overdue justice. According to Cicero, Oppianicus's killing began with ambition. He wanted to marry into the Larinum elite, and according to the speech cleared his path by murder rather than courtship. Cicero claims Oppianicus poisoned his brother-in-law to inherit his estate, then murdered his own pregnant sister-in-law and her unborn child, so that a rival line of inheritance would vanish entirely. He is accused of killing his own wife, then his brother, then attempting, repeatedly, almost compulsively, to poison Cluentius himself, the stepson who would eventually stand trial for finishing what Oppianicus allegedly started against so many others. By Cicero's count, Oppianicus was responsible, directly or through hired hands, for as many as 10 deaths across roughly a decade, a figure so extraordinary that some modern historians have wondered whether Cicero simply attributed to one convenient dead man every unexplained death Larinum had accumulated in that period, folding local tragedy and rumor alike into a single villain his living client could be measured against. And this is where Oppianicus becomes less a documented criminal and more a kind of historical mirror, reflecting back whatever the person examining him needs to see. Was he truly a serial poisoner operating with near total impunity across a decade, protected by wealth and social standing in a republic that Cicero elsewhere describes as thoroughly corrupted by bribery? Or was he a convenient monster, a dead man who could not object to the accusations piled onto him, useful precisely because his silence was permanent? Cicero had every incentive to make Oppianicus as villainous as language allowed. The entire defense of Cluentius depended on making poisoning look less like Cluentius's crime, and more like Oppianicus's inheritance, a family trait finally turned back on its source. We know Oppianicus was convicted of at least one crime in his lifetime. Jury tampering, in an earlier and separate trial, itself a scandal so notorious that Cicero references it as established fact rather than accusation. But conviction for bribing a jury is a long way from proof of 10 murders, and the murders themselves rest entirely on Cicero's reconstruction, delivered years after the alleged killer could no longer answer for himself. There is also the matter of Oppianicus's own death, which Cicero frames as poisoning by Cluentius's hand. Yet even this is not straightforward. Some accounts suggest Oppianicus died after a fall from his horse, an injury that may have been fatal on its own, with poison introduced only as an accusation layered on top of an ordinary accident by enemies eager to see something more sinister in it. If Oppianicus's own death cannot be confirmed as murder with any certainty, what does that suggest about the reliability of the 10 deaths attributed to him while he lived? Cicero built a case so persuasive that Cluentius was acquitted, and Oppianicus's reputation as a serial poisoner survived intact for over 2,000 years, repeated by historians, cited as an example of late Republican moral collapse, treated as fact by generations of readers who had no way to cross-examine the source. Perhaps that is the real subject of this case. Not what Oppianicus did, but what a single skilled advocate could make an entire town and an entire posterity believe about a man who never spoke in his own defense. Cicero himself, in a private letter written years later, is said to have remarked that he had thrown dust in the jurors' eyes during the Cluentius trial, a comment historians still argue over, unsure whether it referred to some minor procedural trick or to something far larger. An admission buried in a single offhand line that the entire elaborate architecture of Oppianicus's guilt might have been built at least in part, on rhetoric rather than fact. If even Cicero doubted his own case in private, what does that leave us to believe about the man he spent an entire trial destroying? A chain, dragged across stone, in the dark corridors beneath a provincial court. That is the sound Roman writers attached to a name 4 centuries after Oppianicus stood accused in absentia. They called him Catena, the chain. Not a nickname earned through affection, but a description of method. A man who, once he had a single thread connecting a suspect to the faintest suggestion of treason, would follow it link by link until it bound an entire household, an entire circle of friends, sometimes an entire province, in accusations from which almost no one escaped. His full name was Paulus, and he served the Emperor Constantius II in the 350s AD, dispatched to Britain in 353 AD on what began as a narrow, specific mission. Investigate a group of army officers suspected of supporting the recently defeated usurper Magnentius, a rival emperor whose rebellion had just been crushed on the continent. It should have been a contained inquiry. Roman administration, even at its most brutal, generally understood the value of limits: punish the guilty, reassure the province, move on. Paulus understood no such thing, or chose to ignore it entirely. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing decades later and drawing on accounts from those who lived through it, describes what happened next as something closer to an infection than an investigation. Paulus arrived in Britain with imperial authority and, according to Ammianus, almost immediately exceeded whatever mandate he had been given, arresting not just the officers under suspicion but anyone connected to them, then anyone connected to those connections, spiraling outward until Roman citizens with no plausible link to Magnentius found themselves in chains for offenses as vague as owning a piece of clothing that might once have belonged to someone now under suspicion. Ammianus records the case of a man tortured and condemned merely for wearing a robe embroidered with symbols that could, under enough imaginative pressure, be interpreted as auspicious of imperial ambition. Guilt assembled not from action, but from proximity, from fabric, from the sheer misfortune of being noticed by a man whose authority seemed to grow with every accusation he made. Why did no one stop him? This is the question that makes Paulus more than a footnote of provincial cruelty. Martinus, the Roman military commander governing Britain at the time, appears to have tried. Ammianus describes Martinus pleading with Paulus to spare at least those clearly innocent, appealing to whatever limits Roman law still theoretically held. Paulus, we're told, responded by threatening to have Martinus himself dragged back to the emperor in chains alongside the men he was trying to protect. And Martinus, cornered, drew his sword, attempted to kill Paulus, failed, and turned the blade on himself instead. A Roman commander, driven to suicide rather than watch his province consumed by an investigator he could not control, nor outrank in practice, whatever his official rank suggested on paper. What does it say about the machinery of imperial power that a single agent, operating at the edge of the empire, could make a general choose death over resistance? The deeper question Ammianus leaves largely unanswered is what Constantius II actually knew or wanted. Was Paulus a rogue agent, exceeding his authority so dramatically that the emperor himself would have been horrified by events in Britain? Or was the chain-like expansion of guilt precisely the point? A deliberate strategy of terror, useful to an emperor who had just watched a usurper very nearly succeed, and who may have calculated that a province gripped by fear of arbitrary accusation was less likely to breed the next Magnentius. Ammianus, writing under later emperors and generally sympathetic to restrained governance, condemns Paulus without reservation, but he does not tell us whether Constantius ever recalled him, reprimanded him, or reviewed the wreckage of arrests left behind in Britain. The silence from the imperial center is, in its own way, as unsettling as anything Paulus did directly. and there is the matter of what became of him. Ammianus's history, our primary and nearly only source, simply moves on to other events after Britain, leaving Paulus's later career and eventual fate almost entirely undocumented. Did he return to favor at court? His methods rewarded rather than questioned? Did he apply the same expanding logic of guilt to some other province we simply have no surviving record of? Nicknames like Catena tend to attach to men who repeat themselves, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. That Britain in 353 was not an aberration in his career, but simply the one instance a historian happened to witness closely enough to write down. What remains, finally, is a name that functioned as a warning even in antiquity, invoked, in later Roman writing, as shorthand for the particular horror of an investigation with no natural end, guilt manufactured link by link until it reached wherever the investigator wished it to reach. How many chains like his went undocumented across the empire's long life, leaving no Ammianus to record them, no Martinus dramatic enough in his final refusal to be remembered at all. Across the channel from the Briton, Paulus once terrorized, and roughly 3 decades later, a different kind of threat was gathering. Not in the shadow of a courtroom, but along the military roads of Gaul and Spain, where a deserter named Maternus was about to prove that the empire's greatest danger to itself sometimes wore its own uniform first. The year is around 186 AD. The reign belongs to Commodus, and the man at the center of this story began his career as an ordinary Roman soldier. A detail worth sitting with, because everything that follows depends on it. Maternus did not begin as an outsider to Roman power. He was trained by it, armed by it, disciplined within its ranks, before he deserted sometime in the mid-1980s and did something almost no deserter in Roman history managed to do. He did not simply flee and vanish. He was recruited. Herodian, our principal source for these events, describes Maternus gathering other deserters to his cause, then breaking open prisons and offering freedom to the men held inside, swelling his numbers with escaped slaves and criminals until what had begun as one soldier's desertion had become, in Herodian's telling, something closer to an army, one with no banner, no legitimate claim, and apparently no interest in negotiating with the state it had abandoned. What did Maternus actually want? This is where the case resists easy classification. He and his growing band moved through Gaul and Spain attacking towns, and here the sources diverge in a way that matters enormously for how we understand him. Was this simple banditry at an unprecedented scale? Organized theft dressed up by a hostile historian as something more threatening? Or was Maternus, as some ancient and modern readers alike have wondered, pursuing something closer to rebellion? An armed challenge to imperial authority itself, using the chaos of raided towns to build toward a larger confrontation with Rome. Herodian offers little insight into ideology, recording actions without clearly assigning motive, which leaves the question of whether Maternus saw himself as a criminal, a liberator, or simply a man who had discovered that a small army could take whatever a single deserter could not. The response from Rome tells us how seriously the threat was taken, regardless of how history has chosen to label it. Commodus, according to Herodian, eventually dispatched regular troops with explicit orders to suppress Maternus's forces. Not local militia, not provincial guards improvising a response, but organized military units treating a former soldier's rebellion as a matter demanding imperial-level force. Some of Maternus's followers were killed. Others reportedly melted back into the populations they'd emerged from. Deserters and escaped prisoners disappearing into a countryside that had, perhaps, never fully distinguished between bandit and neighbor in the first place. And then, if Herodian is to be believed, Maternus did something that transforms this story from provincial unrest into something approaching legend. Having lost his army in Gaul and Spain, he is said to have turned his ambitions toward Rome itself, allegedly plotting to infiltrate the city during the festival of Sibyl, disguise himself and his remaining followers as Praetorian guards using stolen equipment, and assassinate Commodus during the celebrations, seizing the throne in the resulting chaos. It is an extraordinary claim. A deserter turned bandit turned would-be emperor, undone, according to Herodian, only because some of his own men, either from fear or rivalry, betrayed the plot before it could unfold, resulting in his capture and execution. How much of this can we actually trust? Herodian wrote his history decades after these events, working in a style that favored dramatic narrative over documentary precision, and no other surviving source corroborates the assassination plot in comparable detail. Some historians have wondered whether the Sibylle festival plan was real, embellished, or invented entirely, perhaps by Commodus's own regime, eager to justify harsh reprisals against banditry by retroactively inflating a provincial nuisance into a foiled regicide, transforming an inconvenient deserter into the villain of a thwarted assassination that made the emperor's survival look providential rather than lucky. Or perhaps it happened almost exactly as described, and Commodus came astonishingly close to being killed by a common soldier who had simply walked away from his post years earlier and built, from nothing, an army capable of nearly reaching the throne itself. What lingers either way is the uncomfortable arithmetic at the center of the story. An empire that could crush organized legions on distant frontiers apparently struggled, for a period of real duration, to contain a force built from deserters and freed prisoners with no legitimate resources behind them at all. If Maternus truly came as close to Commodus as Herodian claims, it suggests something troubling about how thin the membrane was between imperial security and catastrophe. And if he didn't, if the assassination plot was invention rather than fact, it suggests something almost as troubling: that Rome preferred a story of a defeated would-be emperor to the plainer, more embarrassing truth of a bandit it simply never managed to catch in time. Some miles east of the forums and palaces we have just left, past the coastal roads and garrison towns of the Roman world, the landscape changes. The hills grow drier, the light harsher, the stones older. Here, in the Roman province of Judea, in the decades before Jerusalem's temple would fall to fire and siege, a different kind of danger moved through the crowds. Not soldiers in formation, not senators plotting in marble halls, but single men, robed like everyone else, blades hidden beneath their cloaks. They called themselves, or were called by others, the Sicarii, from the Latin sica, a short, curved dagger small enough to conceal in the folds of a garment. It was a weapon built for closeness, not for the battlefield, but for the marketplace, the festival crowd, the narrow street where a man might brush past his target, feel resistance, and walk on before anyone understood what had happened. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing decades after these events, is our primary witness, and he describes the method with a kind of clinical horror. The Sicarii, he tells us, would mingle with festival crowds in Jerusalem, particularly during the great pilgrimages when the city swelled with visitors from across the province. They would draw close to a chosen victim, often a Jewish aristocrat or official seen as too accommodating to Rome, strike quickly with the hidden dagger, then join the cries of alarm and confusion that followed, vanishing into the very panic they had created. It is worth pausing here because the method itself tells us something the surviving sources rarely state outright. This was not simply violence, it was theater, calibrated for maximum psychological effect. A death in the open, among witnesses, followed by the killer's disappearance. It left behind not just a body, but a question that could never be fully answered. Who did this, and who might be next? Fear, in other words, was not a byproduct of the Sicarii's campaign. It may have been the point. The conventional historical account places the Sicarii within the broader landscape of Jewish resistance to Roman rule in the 1st century AD, a radical offshoot, some scholars argue, of the Zealot movement, though the exact relationship between the two groups remains genuinely contested among historians. What is generally agreed upon is the target selection. The Sicarii appear to have focused less on Roman occupiers directly and more on fellow Jews, particularly the priestly and aristocratic classes perceived as collaborators. This detail alone complicates any simple narrative of anti-imperial resistance. Was this liberation theology carried out with a blade, or something closer to a purge, aimed inward as much as outward? Josephus records one act attributed to the group that moves beyond individual killings altogether: the burning of debt records held in the archives of Jerusalem, an act that would have erased financial obligations for the poor and, not incidentally, thrown the ruling classes into disarray. If accurate, this suggests a movement with aims broader than mere assassination, something closer to social revolution, using terror as one tool among several. But how much of Josephus's account can we trust? He was, after all, a former rebel commander who defected to Rome, writing his history under the patronage of the very empire the Sicarii had opposed. His portrait of them as fanatics, even as a kind of proto-terrorist cult, may reflect genuine observation, or it may reflect the need of a man rebuilding his reputation in Roman eyes to distance himself from the movement's more radical edges. This is where the mainstream historical record begins to thin, and where the more speculative threads take hold. Sicarii's most famous chapter, their final stand at the fortress of Masada in AD 73 or 74, has become, in the centuries since, one of the most mythologized episodes in Jewish history. Josephus describes a mass suicide. Nearly 1,000 men, women, and children choosing death over capture, drawing lots to determine who would kill whom until a final survivor was left to end his own life. It is a story of extraordinary resolve, cited for generations as an emblem of resistance against impossible odds. And yet archaeologists who have excavated Masada since the mid-20th century have found only a handful of skeletal remains at the site, far fewer than Josephus's account would suggest for a group of that size. Some researchers point to this discrepancy as evidence that the mass suicide, as dramatically rendered, may be partly or wholly a literary construction, a moral lesson dressed as history, meant to elevate resistance into something closer to sacred martyrdom. Others argue that the missing remains simply reflect the passage of 2,000 years, the scavenging of animals, the decay of exposed bone in an arid but not inert climate. Both positions have their defenders. Neither has definitively won. There is also the matter of who, precisely, the Sicarii were speaking to, and for whom their violence was truly intended. Some historians have proposed that the group's targeting of the wealthy and the entanglement of political grievance with economic resentment suggest an organization far more concerned with internal Jewish politics than with Rome itself, using the language of resistance while pursuing something closer to score settling. If true, it would mean the group's later reputation, as principled rebels against imperial tyranny, was, at least in part, a story told after the fact, shaped by later needs rather than contemporary reality. We are left, then, with a paradox at the heart of the Sicarii. A movement documented by a single conflicted witness, remembered through an ending that may or may not have happened as described, its true motives obscured by the very sources meant to illuminate them. Somewhere beneath the sand and stone of Masada, and beneath 2,000 years of retelling, the dagger men of Jerusalem remain only partly visible. What then were they actually fighting for? And did they believe, in that final moment on the fortress cliffs, that history would remember them as they wished to be remembered? The question we left hanging over the sands of Masada, what does it mean to be remembered as you wished to be remembered, finds an unexpected echo 4 decades earlier and thousands of miles to the north in the scorched plains of northern Mesopotamia, near a town called Carrhae. Here, too, a man's ending would become inseparable from the myth built around it, until it grew difficult to say where the history stopped and the legend began. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus, and in his lifetime he was, by most accounts, the wealthiest man in Rome. Not wealthy in the abstract sense we might use today, but wealthy in a way that reshaped the city itself. He owned so much of Rome's real estate, acquired through means both legitimate and ethically murky, that entire neighborhoods effectively answered to him. He is said to have assembled a private fire brigade, one of the first of its kind, which would arrive at a burning building not to extinguish the flames but to negotiate a price for the property with the desperate owner, the fire still raging, before agreeing to help. If the price wasn't met, the story goes, his men simply watched it burn. Historians have long debated how to take this account, which comes to us primarily through Plutarch, writing more than a century after Crassus's death. Is it verified fact or moral caricature, a convenient story for later Romans eager to illustrate the dangers of unchecked ambition? The truth likely sits somewhere between documented practice and embellished parable, which is itself worth sitting with. Even in his own era, Crassus seems to have been a man people needed to explain to themselves through story, as though the scale of his wealth demanded a narrative large enough to contain it. That need for narrative becomes even more pronounced when we reach the final chapter of his life, the campaign that would come to define and ultimately end him. In 53 BC, well past the age when most Roman statesmen sought battlefield glory, Crassus marched an army of some 40,000 men into Parthian territory, seeking the military triumph that had eluded him throughout a career spent largely in the political and financial arenas dominated by his rivals, Pompey and a young general named Julius Caesar. Wealth alone, it seems, was not the legacy Crassus wanted. What happened at Carrhae has been studied by military historians for 2,000 years as a case study in tactical catastrophe. The Parthian forces, mounted archers and heavily armored cataphracts, encountered Crassus's legions on open ground poorly suited to Roman infantry formations. The battle, and the retreat that followed, resulted in the deaths of an estimated 20,000 Roman soldiers, with thousands more captured. Crassus himself died in the aftermath, though the precise circumstances remain genuinely uncertain. Some ancient sources describe him killed during a proposed parley that collapsed into violence. Others suggest a more deliberate execution once the Parthians realized who they held. It is what comes next in the ancient accounts that shifts the story from military history into something closer to legend. Several sources, again Plutarch chief among them, report that after Crassus's death the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat, a symbolic punishment for the greed that had defined his career and, in Roman eyes, motivated his entire eastern campaign. Is this verified history? Almost certainly not in any documentable sense. No physical evidence could confirm or deny such an act, and the story serves too neatly as poetic justice to be accepted without suspicion. But its persistence across multiple ancient writers, working from now lost sources, raises its own question. Did something like this happen, distorted through retelling, or did Crassus's reputation for avarice simply demand a fitting death, one that later chroniclers were all too willing to supply? There is a further mystery folded into the aftermath of Carrhae, one that has occupied historians and amateur researchers alike for generations. Thousands of Roman soldiers were captured by the Parthians following the battle, and their fate afterward grows difficult to trace with confidence. Some ancient sources suggest they were resettled far to the east, along the fringes of the Parthian Empire, possibly near the border of what is now Central Asia. This has fed a persistent and largely speculative theory that some of these captured legionaries eventually made their way even further east into Chinese territory, perhaps ending up as mercenaries in service to local warlords. The theory gained particular traction in the 20th century, tied to a small town in China's Gansu province, where local features and building styles were once claimed to bear unusual Western characteristics. Mainstream historians remain deeply skeptical of any direct connection, citing a lack of solid archaeological or genetic evidence to support it, and the theory today is generally regarded as intriguing folklore rather than established history. But the fact that the theory persists at all, that it continues to be raised, investigated, and debated, speaks to something unresolved in the story of Carhae itself. Thousands of men vanished from the historical record after that battle. Where they went, no source can say with certainty. What, then, do we make of a man whose life was defined by the visible accumulation of wealth, and whose death, however it truly occurred, became a story about wealth's poison? And what became of the soldiers who marched east with him into a defeat so total that it swallowed not just an army, but for many of them, their place in history altogether? Somewhere between the ash of Rome's burning buildings and the dust of a Mesopotamian battlefield, the full truth of Marcus Licinius Crassus remains only partly recovered. Gold, we left it, poured molten down a dying man's throat as punishment for greed. One empire's judgment on a Roman general's ambition. But gold does not stay buried in metaphor for long. 3 decades earlier, and back within Rome's own walls, gold of a very different kind was changing hands at a terrifying pace, not as punishment but as plunder, and the man collecting it would become one of the most quietly notorious figures of the late Republic. His name, as recorded by history, was Lucius Cornelius Chrysogonus, though some later manuscripts render it with the added praenomen Marcus, a discrepancy that itself hints at how imperfectly this man's record has survived. He appears in our sources not as a general or a senator, but as something the Roman world had rarely seen wield this kind of power before. A freedman, a former slave, who rose to become one of the most feared men in Rome during the dictatorship of Lucius Cornelius Sulla. To understand Chrysogonus, we have to understand the machinery he operated within. In 82 BC, after winning a brutal civil war, Sulla instituted the proscriptions, public lists of Roman citizens declared enemies of the state, men who could be killed on sight, their property seized and auctioned by the state, often to associates of the regime at prices far below their true worth. It was, in effect, state-sanctioned plunder dressed in the language of political purification. And Chrysogonus, freed by Sulla and granted his patron's own family name, positioned himself at the very center of this machinery, buying seized estates at auction for a fraction of their value, and, in at least one documented case, orchestrating a man's death simply to acquire what he owned. That is the reason we know Chrysogonus' name at all. In 80 BC, a Roman citizen named Sextus Roscius of Ameria was murdered in the streets of Rome. Stabbed, according to the surviving account, near a public bathhouse, his body identified before dawn. His own son, also named Sextus Roscius, was then accused of the murder, a charge that on its surface made little sense. Patricide was among the gravest crimes imaginable in Roman law, and the evidence against the younger Roscius was thin. But someone needed a guilty party, and swiftly, because in the chaos following the elder Roscius's death, his substantial estate, including 13 farms along the Tiber, had been added to the proscription lists, despite Rome's civil war having already ended, and purchased at auction for a strikingly small sum. The buyer, our sources tell us, was Chrysogonus. The case might have vanished from history entirely, one obscure murder among the many the proscriptions generated, had it not attracted a young, largely untested advocate willing to take an extraordinary risk, defending the accused son by directly implicating a favorite of the dictator Sulla himself. That advocate was Marcus Tullius Cicero, and his speech, Pro Rotio Amerino, delivered when he was barely 26 years old, survives to this day as our primary window into Chrysogonus's world. Cicero paints him in vivid, almost theatrical terms. A man of humble origins, now living in extravagant luxury, his home filled with silver and Corinthian bronze, his table set with delicacies, a man, Cicero suggests, whose sudden wealth had made him arrogant enough to believe himself untouchable. Here is where the mainstream record grows thin, and where genuine historical uncertainty takes hold. Did Chrysogonus orchestrate the murder of the elder Roscius directly, hiring the assassins Cicero names in his speech? Or did he simply seize an opportunity after the fact, exploiting a killing that had nothing to do with him to acquire property through the prescription system he knew how to manipulate? Cicero's speech, brilliant as advocacy, was not written as neutral history. It was constructed to win an acquittal, and it required a villain sufficiently monstrous to explain away the case against his client. How much of the portrait we've inherited reflects courtroom strategy rather than documented fact? Perhaps stranger still is what happened after the trial. Cicero won. The younger Roscius was acquitted, and by all rights, a direct accusation against one of Sulla's inner circle should have ended the young advocate's career, or worse. Instead, nothing happened. No retaliation against Cicero is recorded, and Chrysogonus himself simply disappears from the historical record entirely after this trial. No account of his death survives. No later reference tracks his fortune, his fate, or his standing under Sulla in the years that followed. A man, once wealthy enough to be described down to the bronze fittings of his household, vanishes from Roman history, as though the door of the archive was quietly closed behind him. Was he quietly removed by Sulla himself, an embarrassment now too public to protect? Did he retreat from public life, his influence spent once his patron's own power began to wane? Or did something else entirely happen to him, something no surviving source thought worth recording, or that has simply been lost across 2,000 years of fragmentary transmission? We know Chrysogonus through the words of the man who destroyed his reputation in open court, and almost nothing beyond that single, blazing moment. What became of the freedman who once owned 13 farms and a dead man's fortune? And why does history close its eyes to him so completely the moment his trial ends? 2.5 centuries would pass before Rome produced a scandal to rival what a freedman once did with prescription lists and a dead man's farms. But when it came, it did not arrive through the quiet manipulation of paperwork and auctions. It arrived instead in the full and humiliating light of public spectacle, on the floor of the Roman Forum itself, where the empire's highest office was, for the first and only time in its history, sold aloud to the highest bidder. The date was March 28th in the year 193 AD. The location was the Praetorian camp just outside Rome's walls, headquarters of the Praetorian Guard, the elite force originally created to protect the emperor, but which had, by this point in Roman history, grown accustomed to a far more dangerous role, deciding who the emperor would be. 3 days earlier, the Guard had murdered the reigning emperor Pertinax, a man who had attempted, apparently too aggressively, to reform their privileges and discipline after the excesses of his predecessor Commodus's reign. With the throne suddenly and violently vacant, the Praetorians made a decision that shocked even a Roman public well accustomed to political instability. They announced that the imperial title itself would go to whoever offered them the most money. What followed has become one of the most discussed episodes in Roman history, cited for centuries afterward as a symbol of imperial decay. 2 men arrived to bid. One was Titus Flavius Sulpicianus, Pertinax's own father-in-law, and the urban prefect of Rome, who began negotiating from within the camp itself. The other was Marcus Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator, reportedly roused from a dinner party by his family and urged toward the camp before Sulpicianus could secure the throne uncontested. According to our primary sources, chiefly the historian Cassius Dio, who lived through these events and later became a senator himself, the two men then began bidding against each other from opposite sides of the camp's fortified wall, their offers shouted up to the guards or relayed by messenger, climbing higher with each exchange. Julianus is said to have ultimately won with an offer of 25,000 sesterces per soldier, an almost incomprehensible sum multiplied across the entire Praetorian force. The gates opened. Julianus was declared emperor. It is worth pausing on how strange this moment truly was, and remains. Rome had seen emperors rise through inheritance, through military acclamation, through conspiracy and assassination. But never before and never again had the office been auctioned this openly, this literally, with two bidders calling out figures like merchants over a cargo of grain. Cassius Dio, writing with what reads like genuine disgust, presents the auction almost as proof that the empire's legitimacy had rotted from within, that power, stripped of any remaining pretense, had simply become a commodity. And yet here, the mainstream account, so vivid and specific, begins to raise its own quiet questions. Dio was writing with hindsight, and with his own political sensibilities regarding the Praetorians and the chaos of that year, sensibilities that may have shaped just how theatrically he chose to render the bidding war. Was the auction truly as literal and public as Dio describes, shouted across a wall like a scene from a play? Or has retelling, and the demands of dramatic history, sharpened what may have been a messier, more privately negotiated transaction into the vivid set piece we remember today? We cannot fully separate the event from the account of the man most responsible for preserving it. What is not in dispute is what happened next. Julianus's reign, purchased at such extraordinary cost, lasted only 66 days. The Roman public, informed of how their emperor had obtained his office, greeted him with open contempt, jeering him in the streets according to Dio, and refusing him the ceremonial welcomes an emperor might expect. Meanwhile, 3 separate military commanders stationed across the empire's frontiers, each with legions loyal to them personally, declared themselves emperor in response to the forum's scandal, refusing to accept a throne bought rather than earned. Of these 3, Septimius Severus, commanding the legions in Pannonia, marched on Rome fastest. Julianus, we are told, attempted to buy his way out of the crisis, just as he had bought his way in, offering to share power with Severus, then reportedly raising his offer further as Severus's army drew closer to the city. Nothing worked. The Praetorian Guard itself, having sold the throne once already, appears to have simply switched allegiance, arresting Julianus and executing him in the palace on June 1st. His final words, according to Dio, were a question, asking simply what wrong he had done and to whom. It is a strange, almost hollow question to be left with. Julianus had, by any reading of Roman law and precedent at the time, done nothing that the Praetorians themselves hadn't invited. He had simply won an auction the Guard had opened. That the empire's citizens, and eventually its armies, found this arrangement unforgivable, tells us something about where legitimacy was still believed to reside in the Roman mind, somewhere beyond price, however openly price had just been offered. But how much of what we know of those 66 days is documented fact, and how much is the shape later historians gave to a scandal they needed to explain? Somewhere in the space between the forum's shouted bids and Cassius Dio's finished history, the full truth of that spring in 193 AD remains only partially recoverable. Picture torchlight flickering against marble columns, the low murmur of women's voices, the sweet smoke of incense rising through a private household at night, a scene from which men were, by ancient law and older custom, strictly forbidden. This was the Bona Dea festival, a sacred rite honoring the good goddess, celebrated each December in Rome behind closed doors, guarded jealously as one of the few religious spaces belonging entirely to Roman women. And it was here, in December of 62 BC, that one man's decision to cross that threshold would ignite a scandal reshaping the final, turbulent years of the Roman Republic. His name was Publius Clodius Pulcher, and by the time of the Bona Dea affair, he was already a study in contradiction. Born into one of Rome's oldest and most distinguished patrician families, the Clodi, a lineage stretching back to the Republic's founding, Clodius seemed determined throughout his life to work against the very class that had produced him. He would later go so far as to arrange his own adoption into a plebeian family, a legal maneuver of questionable propriety, purely so he could stand for the office of tribune of the plebs, a position constitutionally closed to patricians. It was a move that told Rome a great deal about who Clodius was, a man willing to bend, or simply break, the machinery of Roman law when it stood between him and power. But it was the events of that December night that first placed him fully in the public eye, and in the historical record we still study today. The Bona Dea rites that year were being held at the home of Julius Caesar, then serving as Pontifex Maximus, whose wife Pompeia was hosting the ceremony in his household. According to our sources, chiefly Cicero and Plutarch, Clodius disguised himself as a woman, a lute girl or musician, and slipped into the gathering, reportedly to pursue a romantic liaison with Pompeia herself, though this motive rests entirely on later testimony rather than anything Clodius admitted directly. He was discovered, the story goes, when his voice gave him away to a servant, and the ceremony dissolved into chaos and outrage as the sacred rite was declared defiled by a male presence. The scandal that followed reshaped Roman politics for years. Clodius was formally charged with sacrilege, a serious religious and civic offense, and stood trial before the Senate. Caesar notably refused to testify against him directly, offering instead his now famous line that his wife must be above suspicion. Yet he divorced Pompeia regardless, a decision that has puzzled historians ever since. If Caesar believed Clodius genuinely guilty, why decline to condemn him outright? If he believed the charges baseless, why end his marriage over it at all? Caesar's own calculation at this moment remains, even now, difficult to fully reconstruct. Was this principle, political caution, or something closer to a debt being quietly settled? Clodius was ultimately acquitted, though Cicero, testifying against him, later claimed the jury had been extensively bribed, a charge widely believed by ancient historians, though naturally impossible to verify with certainty at this distance. What is beyond dispute is that the trial made Clodius and Cicero bitter enemies, a rivalry that would follow both men for the remainder of their lives and eventually contribute to Cicero's temporary exile from Rome in 58 BC. Engineered through legislation, Clodius pushed through during his tribunate. From this point forward, Clodius's career reads almost as a case study in the use of organized violence as a political instrument. He assembled armed gangs that patrolled the streets of Rome, intimidating rivals, disrupting the political process, and effectively controlling entire districts of the city through force rather than office. Opposing this were similar gangs organized by his rival Titus Annius Milo, and through the late 50s BC, Rome's streets became genuine battlegrounds between these factions, with the Senate largely unable to restore order. This rivalry reached its final, fatal point on January 18, 52 BC, on the Appian Way outside Rome, where Clodius and Milo's respective retinues encountered each other by what our sources describe as chance. A brawl broke out between their attendants. Clodius was wounded and taken to a nearby inn, where Milo, according to the prevailing ancient account, ordered his men to finish what the street fight had started. Clodius was killed, and his body brought back to Rome, where the news ignited riots so severe that the Senate house itself was burned by an enraged mob, using Clodius's own funeral pyre as kindling. Was the encounter on the Appian Way truly accidental? As most ancient accounts suggest, two armed factions crossing paths by unhappy coincidence. Or was it, as some historians have proposed, a planned ambush by Milo, who had far more to gain from Clodius's permanent removal than any chance encounter would suggest? Cicero himself later wrote a defense speech for Milo, though delivered, by his own admission, far less effectively than intended, reportedly unsettled by the hostile crowd and armed guards filling the courtroom. Milo was convicted regardless and exiled. What exactly transpired on that road, in the brief and violent minutes before Clodius died, remains contested territory for historians even now, a single afternoon's collision of ambition, chance, and grievance, from which one of Rome's most disruptive careers came to its abrupt and still uncertain end. The road outside Rome, we left it stained with one man's blood and one family's ambition. But the Appian Way was not the only site where violence moved through families like a current, unseen until it surfaced in a courtroom. Turn now to a household in the small town of Larinum, in southern Italy, and to a woman whose name survives in history for a single reason. She stood accused by her own son of poisoning his father. Her name was Sassia, and what little we know of her comes almost entirely through hostile testimony, specifically through another of Cicero's surviving courtroom speeches, delivered in defense of a man named Aulus Cluentius Habitus in 66 BC. This case, known to history as the Pro Cluentio, is widely regarded by legal historians as one of the most tangled and difficult of Cicero's career, a story so layered with accusation and counter-accusation across nearly a decade that even Cicero himself, in later years, reportedly admitted to a friend that he had deliberately obscured the truth of the case to win it. A rare and startling confession from an advocate about his own methods. At the center of it all stood Sassia, painted by Cicero in terms almost Gothic in their intensity. According to his account, Sassia had, years earlier, been complicit in, or perhaps orchestrated, the poisoning of her own son-in-law, Aulus Cluentius's stepfather, during a period of bitter family conflict. Her son, the younger Cluentius, had allegedly uncovered evidence of the plot and successfully prosecuted the men responsible for carrying it out. This alone would have made for a dramatic enough family history. But Cicero alleges something considerably darker followed, that Sassia, rather than reconciling with the son who had exposed the earlier crime, instead turned her enmity toward him directly, eventually marrying the very father of one of the men her son had helped convict, a marriage Cicero frames as a calculated act of vengeance, uniting her with a family bent on destroying her own child. The final act of this alleged feud, as Cicero presents it, arrived years later with the death of Sassia's second husband, Statius Albius Oppianicus. When Oppianicus died suddenly, suspicion fell not on Sassia, but on her son Cluentius, accused of poisoning his stepfather in what prosecutors argued was the culmination of a long simmering vendetta. It was this charge that brought Cicero into the case, defending Cluentius against accusations that, in his telling, inverted the true chain of guilt entirely. The real poisoner, Cicero insisted to the jury, was not the son in the dock, but the mother testifying against him, a woman he describes, in some of his most vivid courtroom rhetoric, as possessed by an almost unnatural depth of hatred for her own child. It is here that the mainstream historical record grows genuinely difficult to navigate, and where the case becomes less a settled account of crime than a demonstration of how thoroughly Roman rhetoric could shape or distort the story a jury was permitted to hear. Cicero, remember, was Cluentius's advocate, financially and professionally invested in his client's acquittal. His portrait of Sassia as a monstrous, almost mythic figure of maternal betrayal serves his case perfectly, perhaps too perfectly. Ancient Roman oratory operated under different rules than we might expect from courtroom testimony today. Character assassination, exaggeration, and appeals to a jury's moral horror were standard, accepted tools of persuasion, not deviations from it. How much of Sassia's alleged villainy reflects documented fact, and how much reflects a skilled advocate manufacturing a monster sufficiently vivid to distract a jury from more complicated truths about his own client? We should note, too, that Cluentius was not without his own shadowed history. Years earlier, before this trial, he had already been implicated in accusations of jury bribery, connected to the very prosecution that convicted his stepfather's associates. Accusations serious enough that they nearly cost him his citizenship. A man defended for one alleged poisoning while carrying his own unresolved history of courtroom corruption complicates any simple reading of who, in this family, held the greater share of guilt. Cluentius was acquitted. Sassia's own fate afterward is essentially unrecorded. She vanishes from Roman history at precisely the point Cicero's speech ends, much as Chrysogonus did generations before her, leaving us with no independent account of her later years, no confirmation of guilt or innocence beyond the words of a man paid to destroy her credibility. Did Sassia orchestrate the death of 2 husbands and wage a years-long campaign against her own son, as Cicero insists? Or was she, as some modern historians have quietly suggested, a convenient villain constructed to obscure a case that implicated her son far more directly than history has been willing to record? Somewhere in the space between courtroom performance and family tragedy, the truth of what happened inside that household at Larinum remains, even now, genuinely unrecoverable. A mother remembered only through the voice of the man who needed the world to believe the worst of her. Consider for a moment how often this history has turned on a single voice, a prosecutor's speech, a historian writing decades after the fact, a courtroom performance shaping how we remember the accused long after they can no longer answer for themselves. It is worth holding that thought as we turn to a man whose downfall was engineered by the most powerful voice in Rome, and whose reputation has come down to us almost entirely through the words of those who destroyed him. His name was Lucius Aelius Sejanus, and for nearly a decade he was arguably the second most powerful man in the Roman world, commander of the Praetorian Guard, trusted confidant of the Emperor Tiberius, and by the final years of his ascent, a figure whose influence over imperial administration rivaled that of the emperor himself. To understand how a man born to a family of merely equestrian rank, not senatorial nobility, climbed to such heights, we have to understand the particular vacuum he filled. Tiberius, never a man comfortable with the public performance of rule, withdrew increasingly from Rome as his reign progressed, eventually relocating permanently to the island of Capri in 26 AD, governing the empire from a clifftop villa rather than the Forum. This left an extraordinary gap in the machinery of daily governance, a gap Sejanus filled with remarkable efficiency, becoming the primary channel through which requests, reports, and decisions passed between the isolated emperor and the city he ostensibly still ruled. Sejanus had also critically reorganized the Praetorian Guard years earlier, consolidating its scattered units into a single fortified camp just outside Rome's walls, a logistical reform that also happened to place an unprecedented concentration of military force under his direct personal command. What followed, according to our primary source, the historian Tacitus, was a years-long campaign of consolidation that reads, even at this distance, as genuinely chilling in its patience. Sejanus is described as systematically eliminating potential rivals to his influence, working through prosecutions, exile, and, Tacitus alleges, the quiet removal of anyone standing between himself and the emperor's trust. Most significantly, he was later accused of orchestrating the death of Tiberius's own son and heir apparent, Drusus, in 23 AD, allegedly through slow poisoning, carried out with the help of Drusus's wife Livilla, with whom Sejanus had begun an affair. This accusation did not surface until years after Drusus's death, emerging only once Sejanus's own fall from power was already underway, which raises an uncomfortable question we should sit with honestly. Was this a genuine conspiracy uncovered, or a convenient charge assembled after the fact to justify a destruction already in motion? By 31 AD, Sejanus had risen to remarkable heights. He held the consulship alongside Tiberius himself, an extraordinary honor, and there is evidence he was being positioned, or was positioning himself, for marriage into the imperial family. A request for permission to marry Livilla that Tiberius notably deferred rather than granted outright. And then, with startling speed, it ended. On October 18th of that year, Sejanus was summoned to a Senate meeting, expecting, by most accounts, further honors. Instead, a letter from Tiberius was read aloud, a letter that began, according to Tacitus's famous account, with routine matters before, gradually, methodically, turning toward condemnation, the senators in the room growing visibly uneasy as they realized, partway through the reading, what was actually unfolding before them. Sejanus was arrested that same day and executed before nightfall. What followed his death has become one of the more disturbing footnotes of the entire episode. Sejanus's body, according to Roman custom for condemned traitors, was thrown down the Gemonian stairs, and a public frenzy of retribution swept through Rome in the days after, reportedly extending even to his young children, both of whom were executed shortly afterward, an act so severe that even some ancient sources record public unease at the killing of a daughter too young, by Roman law, to be legally put to death by strangulation in the ordinary manner, requiring, according to Tacitus's grim account, that the method itself be altered to circumvent the law. Here, the mystery deepens rather than resolves. How much did Tiberius actually know, and when did he know it? The gradual, almost theatrical structure of the condemnation letter, beginning innocuously, turning only slowly toward accusation, suggests an emperor either building courage for a confrontation he'd delayed, or one who had, in fact, suspected Sejanus for some time and orchestrated the reveal with calculated patience. Modern historians remain divided on how much of Sejanus's alleged conspiracy against the imperial family was real, and how much was constructed after his fall to justify the sweeping purge of his associates that followed. A purge so extensive that Tacitus describes Rome's law courts occupied for months afterward with prosecutions against anyone who had once been close to him. We are left, once again, with a figure known to us almost entirely through the testimony of those who required his guilt to be absolute. Was Sejanus the master conspirator Tacitus describes, patiently eliminating a path to the throne itself, or was he simply a man who rose too far, too visibly, in the shadow of an emperor who trusted no one indefinitely? Somewhere in the gap between the letter's opening pleasantries and its closing condemnation, the truth of what Sejanus actually intended remains, even now, locked away with the emperor who never fully explained himself. 3.5 centuries before Sejanus's fall, before Praetorian camps or imperial villas on Capri even existed as concepts, Rome faced a different kind of crisis, one that emerged not from the ambitions of a single powerful man, but from what ancient sources describe as a wave of sudden, unexplained deaths sweeping through the households of the city's elite, and a group of women who stood accused of causing them. The year was 331 BC, and Rome, according to the historian Livy, our principal source for this episode, was in the grip of a plague. An epidemic striking down prominent citizens with alarming speed and no apparent pattern. Fear spread through the city as it does in any era facing an invisible killer. Rumor filling the space where explanation should have been. It was in this climate that a servant girl came forward with an accusation that would transform a public health crisis into a criminal one. She claimed the deaths were not the work of disease at all, but poison, prepared and distributed by a network of Roman matrons. What followed, as Livy describes it, unfolded with startling speed and scale. Roman magistrates, acting on the servant's testimony, apprehended a group of women and allegedly caught them in the act of preparing poisonous concoctions in their own homes. When confronted, according to the account, some of the accused women argued the substances were medicinal, not lethal, a defense the magistrates decided to test directly, compelling the women to drink their own preparations in front of witnesses. All who drank, Livy reports, died on the spot, a result treated as definitive proof of guilt. From this initial group, the investigation expanded with a momentum that should give us pause even at 2,000 years' distance. Further accusations followed further arrests, which produced further accusations in turn, until the final tally, according to Livy's account, reached an almost unbelievable number. 170 Roman matrons ultimately condemned and executed for participation in this alleged poisoning conspiracy. It is worth sitting with that number, because it is precisely where the mainstream historical account begins to strain under its own weight. 170 women from Rome's respectable households, allegedly organizing a coordinated campaign of poison across the city. Was this genuinely what modern readers would recognize as a conspiracy, or something closer to what later eras would call a moral panic? A crisis of explanation during a period of mysterious mass death, resolved through accusation rather than evidence? Livy himself was writing more than 3 centuries after these events, working from earlier annalistic sources now lost to us, and he offers the story with a degree of narrative confidence that modern historians have grown increasingly skeptical of. The trial by ordeal method he describes, forcing accused women to drink their own preparations as a test of guilt, reads less like documented judicial procedure and more like the kind of morally satisfying resolution a later chronicler might supply to an otherwise inexplicable epidemic. And this is, perhaps, the heart of the mystery. What actually killed the citizens of Rome in 331 BC? Modern historians and epidemiologists examining this episode have proposed a range of explanations entirely unconnected to poison. Some point to the strong possibility of a genuine infectious outbreak. Rome, in this period, like most ancient cities, remained vulnerable to sudden epidemic disease, and a wave of illness striking prominent households in a short window would have been entirely consistent with pathogens like typhoid or dysentery, spread through contaminated water sources the elite and common citizens may have shared unequally, or unequally blamed. If this is what truly happened, the servant girl's accusation may represent one of history's earliest recorded instances of a natural disease outbreak being reinterpreted, under public pressure and fear, as deliberate human malice, with the tragic consequences for the women who became convenient explanations for a crisis no one at the time could otherwise comprehend. There is also the deeper, more unsettling question of what social tensions this episode may have been channeling. Some historians have noted that accusations of poisoning in the ancient world fell disproportionately on women, whose access to household remedies, herbs, and medicines, entirely ordinary domestic knowledge, could be recast with frightening speed as evidence of hidden malevolence once suspicion took hold. Was this, then, less a conspiracy uncovered than a demonstration of how quickly ordinary knowledge, held by the wrong people, can be transformed into proof of guilt when a society urgently needs someone to blame? We will likely never know with certainty what caused the deaths that alarmed Rome in 331 BC, nor whether the servant girl who set the investigation in motion spoke from genuine knowledge, personal grievance, or something else Livy's account does not preserve. What we're left with is a number, 170, and a story so total in its resolution that it leaves almost no room for the questions it should provoke. Were these women poisoners, victims of panic, or something harder to categorize entirely? Somewhere beneath Livy's confident narrative, in the gap between what truly happened in those households and what later Rome needed to believe had happened, the actual fate of the city that year remains, even now, obscured. The question we left unresolved in the matter of the poisoned matrons, how quickly an ordinary person becomes a convenient explanation for events too large to otherwise understand, finds a very different, but no less troubling echo in the machinery of Roman prosecution itself, nearly 3 centuries later. If the crowd could manufacture guilt out of fear and rumor, the courts of the early empire show us how easily the same instinct could be formalized, dressed in legal procedure, and turned into a career. The setting this time is the Senate House under the Emperor Tiberius, in the year 22nd AD, a body that had, by this point in Roman history, become the primary venue for a particular and unsettling breed of ambitious man, the professional accuser, known in Latin as the delator. These were men who built reputations, and often fortunes, by bringing prosecutions against wealthy or prominent Romans, frequently under laws concerning treason or provincial extortion, collecting a portion of the condemned's confiscated property as reward should the charge succeed. It was a system that transformed accusation itself into a form of commerce, and it produced, across the 1st century AD, some of the most quietly feared men in Roman public life. Among the figures named in connection with this world by the historian Tacitus, our principal source for the period, is a senator called Livineius Regulus. He appears in the surviving record connected to the prosecution of Gaius Verres, a former proconsul of the province of Asia, accused by provincial delegations of extortion and abuse of power during his governorship. A serious charge, and one that, if proven, carried consequences extending well beyond fine or censure. Tacitus's account of the trial itself is detailed and vivid. The accused defended by prominent advocates, the Senate weighing testimony from provincial witnesses transported specifically for the occasion, the eventual verdict resulting in Sejanus's conviction and exile. It is in the margins of this larger, well-documented case that Regulus himself becomes difficult to see clearly. Was he a genuine advocate for provincials wronged by an abusive governor, using the Senate's machinery as it was, in principle, designed to be used? Or was he one of the many ambitious men of his era who recognized, correctly, that prosecution had become a viable path to prominence in a political system that no longer offered the same opportunities for glory through military command or public office that it once had under the Republic? Tacitus, writing decades later and with a documented distaste for the entire culture of the prosecution that flourished under Tiberius and his successors, rarely extends the benefit of the doubt to men who built careers this way. But his hostility toward the practice in general makes it genuinely difficult to assess any single accuser's motives with confidence. What deepens the puzzle around Regulus specifically is how thin the record becomes once we look beyond this single, well-documented case. Unlike the great delatores of the following decades, men like Publius Suilius Rufus, whose prosecutorial career under Clodius became notorious enough that Tacitus devotes considerable attention to his eventual downfall and exile. Regulus simply does not reappear with any prominence in the surviving sources. No later trial bears his name as prosecutor. No senatorial debate references his subsequent career, honors, or disgrace. A man involved in a major provincial extortion case, significant enough to be preserved in Tacitus's narrative at all, seems to vanish from the historical stage almost as completely as Chrysogonus did a century earlier, or Sassia after him. This pattern, recurring now across so many figures in this history, deserves its own moment of reflection. Why do so many of Rome's most consequential minor players simply disappear from the written record the moment their defining scandal concludes? Is it simply the ordinary attrition of ancient sources, the vast majority of Roman documentation lost to time, fire, and neglect, taking with it whatever became of men like Regulus in the years after their brief moment of visibility? Or does it reflect something about how Roman history itself was written and preserved, chronicled not as a continuous record of every participant, but as a sequence of dramatic moments, with the individuals themselves receding into obscurity the instant their scene in the larger drama ends? We are left, then, with only a fragment, a name attached to a real and consequential trial, a role whose full nature, principled advocate or opportunistic accuser, we cannot fully recover, and a life that continues somewhere beyond the final page Tacitus gives him, unrecorded and unremembered. Did Livineius Regulus go on to further prosecutions we simply have no surviving account of? Did he retreat from public life once the case concluded, content with whatever reward or reputation it earned him? Or did his own ambitions eventually draw the same hostile scrutiny he had once turned on others, in some later scandal that time has simply erased? Somewhere in the gap between the Senate's recorded verdict and the silence that follows it, the true shape of this man's career remains, even now, just out of reach. From the Senate House, where accusation once moved through the polished machinery of law and reward, we travel now to a very different center of power, the imperial court of the Emperor Nero, and to the praetorian camp Sejanus himself had once fortified, now commanded by a man whose name would become, for later Romans, nearly synonymous with the worst excesses of Nero's reign. His name was Ofonius Tigellinus, and his rise to power is itself a story that unsettled even contemporaries accustomed to unlikely ascents. Born, by most accounts, to relatively obscure origins in southern Italy, exiled early in his career under the Emperor Caligula, on suspicion of an affair with two of the emperor's sisters, Tigellinus spent years rebuilding his fortune and reputation through what our sources describe as horse breeding and racing. An enterprise that, however unglamorous it sounds, brought him into direct contact with Nero, whose passion for chariot racing was well documented, and, by the standards of his predecessors, unusually genuine. That shared enthusiasm appears to have formed the foundation of a relationship that would eventually place Tigellinus among the most powerful men in Rome. By 62 AD, he had been appointed joint commander of the Praetorian Guard, a position of immense influence, and from this post, according to Tacitus and the later historian Cassius Dio, he became something closer to Nero's chief enabler than his subordinate, a man who reportedly encouraged, rather than restrained, the emperor's increasingly erratic and extravagant behavior, understanding correctly that his own position depended on Nero's continued favor rather than any check on his excesses. It is here that the mainstream historical record begins to blur into territory historians still debate the reliability of. Tigellinus is described by ancient sources as instrumental in the purges that followed the Pisonian conspiracy of 65 AD, a failed plot to assassinate Nero that resulted in a wave of forced suicides and executions among Rome's senatorial class. including the philosopher Seneca and the poet Lucan. Tacitus presents Tigellinus as actively expanding this purge beyond the actual conspirators, using the atmosphere of suspicion to eliminate personal enemies and rivals under the cover of legitimate investigation, a pattern that, if accurate, places him in a lineage stretching back to Sejanus and forward to every regime that has ever used a genuine security threat as justification for settling unrelated scores. But how much of this portrait reflects documented fact, and how much reflects the particular hostility of the sources describing him? Tacitus was writing decades later, under emperors eager to distance themselves from Nero's memory, and his portrait of Tigellinus, cruel, sycophantic, willing to encourage any excess that secured his own position, serves a broader narrative purpose in his history, illustrating precisely how a principate could decay when surrounded by men more interested in survival than counsel. This does not mean the portrait is false, but it does mean we should hold it with the same caution we've applied to every other figure in this history, known to us chiefly through the words of those who outlived and condemned them. What is not contested is how Tigellinus' story ends, and the manner of its ending tells us something about how thoroughly his reputation had calcified even within his own lifetime. When Nero's regime finally collapsed in 68 AD, amid rebellion and the emperor's own suicide, Tigellinus made a calculated decision that should, by any reasonable measure, have secured his safety. He abandoned Nero, transferred his loyalty to the incoming Emperor Galba, and survived the initial transition of power that claimed so many others associated with the fallen regime. For a time, this gamble appeared to work. It did not last. In 69 AD, during the brief and chaotic reign of the Emperor Otho, Tigellinus was forced to take his own life, not primarily through any formal judicial process, but reportedly under pressure from public sentiment so hostile, so persistent, that Otho found it politically necessary to sacrifice him despite having initially permitted him to live. Tacitus describes his death in unusually visceral detail. Tigellinus, suffering from illness, delaying the act as long as possible, ultimately cutting his own throat at the baths in Sinuessa. It is a death that reads, even at this distance, as a kind of public reckoning demanded by a populace that had waited years to see it delivered. And this, perhaps, is where the genuine mystery of Tigellinus resides, not in the disputed details of any single purge or conspiracy, but in the sheer intensity of the hatred that outlasted Nero's own fall by a full year, sufficient to force a new emperor's hand against a man who had, by that point, no formal power left to threaten anyone. Was this hostility proportionate to genuine crimes committed? The purges, the encouraged excesses, the years of enabling a regime increasingly divorced from restraint? Or had Tigellinus become, like so many figures before him in this history, a vessel for something larger than his own individual guilt, a name onto which an entire era's accumulated resentment could finally, safely, be discharged once the man who had truly held power was already gone? Somewhere in the space between documented cruelty and constructed villain, the full measure of Ofonius Tigellinus remains, even now, difficult to weigh with certainty. We have already met this man once before, if only as a name mentioned in passing. The rival whose gangs once battled Clodius Pulcher for control of Rome's streets, the man widely blamed for ordering the fatal blow on the Appian Way. It is time now to turn the camera fully toward him, because Titus Annius Milo's own story, both before and after that January afternoon in 52 BC, reveals a career built as thoroughly on organized violence as any figure we have examined so far. Milo entered Roman public life during one of the Republic's most volatile decades, a period when the traditional machinery of politics, elections, legislation, the Senate's deliberations, had become increasingly entangled with, and dependent upon, the private armies wealthy men assembled from the city's laboring poor, freedmen, and gladiatorial schools. He rose to the office of tribune of the plebs in 57 BC, and it was in this role that he first assembled the armed retinue that would define the remainder of his career, ostensibly to counter Clodius's own gangs, which had already been terrorizing political opponents for several years by that point. What followed was, by most historical accounts, less a political rivalry than a slow-burning urban war fought through intermediaries in Rome's streets and forums. Cicero, whom Milo's forces had helped protect and eventually assisted in recalling from the exile Clodius had engineered against him, became a natural ally and later Milo's most prominent defender. The alliance placed Milo firmly within the Optimates faction, aligned against the populist politics Clodius represented, though how much genuine ideological commitment underlay this alignment versus simple personal enmity between two ambitious men and their competing gangs remains difficult for historians to disentangle with confidence. The violence between their factions grew severe enough that by the early months of 52 BC, Rome's ordinary political functions had become nearly impossible to conduct. Consular elections that should have taken place the previous year remained unresolved, the city periodically descending into open street fighting between Milo's and Clodius's men. It was against this backdrop of accumulated tension that their forces crossed paths on the Appian Way that January, an encounter that ended, as we have already explored, with Clodius dead and Rome's Senate house burned by rioters using his funeral pyre as kindling. Here, the mainstream account, well documented through the Cicero's surviving defense speech and Asconius's later commentary on it, presents a picture that should give us pause precisely because of how thoroughly it has been shaped by advocacy. Cicero's Pro Malone survives as one of his most polished orations, arguing forcefully that the fatal encounter was Clodius's doing, an ambush Clodius himself had planned, with Milo acting purely in self-defense once violence erupted. Yet the speech we possess today is, by Cicero's own later admission and by the testimony of witnesses present at the actual trial, a substantially revised version, composed after the fact and considerably more composed than what he delivered in the courtroom, where the presence of armed soldiers stationed by the presiding authorities to prevent further violence reportedly so unsettled Cicero that his delivery faltered badly. This discrepancy matters, because it means our clearest surviving account of what happened on the Appian Way was never actually tested in its most persuasive form against a jury. The version we read is a reconstruction, polished at leisure, of an argument that failed in its original, more anxious delivery. Milo was convicted and sentenced to exile in Massilia, modern Marseille, where ancient tradition holds he later received a copy of Cicero's finished, more eloquent speech, and remarked, with what sources present as genuine irony, that it was fortunate Cicero had not delivered it so well in court. For had he done so, Milo joked, he would never have gotten to enjoy the excellent fish of Massilia. Whether that anecdote is genuine or a later embellishment appended to a man already destined for storytelling is impossible to confirm at this distance, but it points toward something worth considering. Even in exile, Milo's story continued generating narrative, continued being shaped and reshaped by those recounting it. He did not remain quietly in Massilia. In 48 BC, he returned to Italy and joined an uprising against Julius Caesar, then consolidating power after his victory in the civil war against Pompey. An uprising that failed swiftly, resulting in Milo's death during a siege at Cosa, killed, our sources suggest, almost as an afterthought to a conflict on a scale that had by then rendered the old street violence between his and Clodius's gangs almost quaint by comparison. What are we to make of a man whose defining act of violence comes to us filtered through a speech admittedly rewritten after its failure, whose final defiant joke about that same speech may itself be invention layered onto invention? Did Milo truly order Clodius's death in cold calculation, as prosecutors alleged, or did chance and accumulated tension genuinely collide that January afternoon, as Cicero insisted? Somewhere between the courtroom Cicero lost and the version of events he later polished for posterity, the true architecture of what happened on the Appian Way, and the man most blamed for it, remains only partially recoverable. Massilia's coastline and Milo's exile lie now behind us. Follow the Mediterranean instead toward its eastern edge, past Greece, past Asia Minor, to the Roman province of Syria and the city of Antioch, where in the autumn of 19 AD a Roman prince lay dying, convinced with his final breaths that he had been murdered, and where the woman he blamed would become one of the most elusive figures in the empire's early criminal history. Her name, as it survives in our sources, was Martina, and almost everything we know about her comes to us second-hand, filtered through accusation, rumor, and a death that occurred before she could ever be formally questioned. The dying prince was Germanicus, adopted son of the Emperor Tiberius, a celebrated general whose popularity with the Roman public and army had, by most historical assessments, grown to rival that of the emperor himself. Sent east to oversee Rome's provinces in the region, Germanicus found himself in escalating conflict with Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, the governor of Syria, a conflict our primary source Tacitus describes as bitter enough that Piso appeared to Germanicus and his household to be actively working to undermine and humiliate him. When Germanicus fell fatally ill in Antioch, wasting over a period our sources describe with genuine horror, his body reportedly showing symptoms his own attendants found consistent with poisoning rather than natural disease. Suspicion turned immediately toward Piso's household, and specifically toward Piso's wife, Munatia Plancina. It was here that Martina entered the historical record. Described by Tacitus as a woman notorious in the region for her knowledge of poisons, closely associated with and allegedly favored by Plancina, Martina became the figure through whom the accusation against Piso's family took physical, tangible form. The evidence assembled against her, as our sources describe it, reads as genuinely unsettling even filtered through 2,000 years of transmission. Investigators searching Germanicus's residence reportedly discovered remains of what were interpreted as curse tablets and other objects associated with the era's practice of malevolent magic, hidden within the walls and floor. Human remains, ash, and lid tablets inscribed with Germanicus's name, tucked into recesses that suggested deliberate concealment rather than accident. Whether these objects were genuinely placed by Martina, planted by someone else entirely, or discovered through investigators eager to find exactly the kind of damning evidence the political situation demanded, is a question the ancient sources themselves cannot fully resolve, and modern historians remain divided on how literally to interpret this detail at all. Germanicus, before his death, reportedly named both Piso and Plancina directly as responsible for his condition, urging his household and friends to seek justice against them upon his return to Rome, testimony that, whatever its ultimate accuracy, ensured the accusation would follow Piso back to the capital, regardless of what evidence could later be substantiated. And it is at precisely this point that Martina's story takes its strangest, least resolved turn. Following Germanicus's death, Martina was sent to Rome, presumably to testify in the trial that would eventually be brought against Piso for his role in the affair, a trial that promised to be one of the most closely watched legal proceedings of Tiberius's reign, given Germanicus's popularity and the political stakes involved for the emperor himself. She never arrived to give that testimony. According to Tacitus, Martina died suddenly at Brundisium, the port city where her ship had docked en route to Rome. And the manner of her death, a hidden packet of poison reportedly discovered concealed in a knot of her hair, struck contemporaries as almost too fitting to be coincidental. A woman renowned for her expertise in poison, dying by poison, at the exact moment her testimony could have clarified or complicated the case against one of Rome's most powerful families. Was this genuine suicide, chosen to avoid interrogation that might have implicated her further, or to protect Plancina and Piso from testimony that could prove damaging? Or was it, as some ancient observers apparently suspected even at the time, a killing disguised as self-destruction, silencing a witness whose knowledge had become too dangerous for someone to allow into a Roman courtroom? Piso himself, once his trial finally began in Rome, died before its conclusion. Found with his throat cut, officially ruled a suicide amid mounting evidence against him, though this death too generated immediate and lasting suspicion that Tiberius's own household may have intervened to prevent testimony that could have proven politically damaging to the emperor. Martina's death was simply the first domino in a pattern of convenient silences that followed Germanicus's poisoning from Antioch all the way to Rome. What did she actually know, and for whom, if anyone, was she truly working? The knot of poison in her hair may be the closest thing history offers to an answer, and it tells us almost nothing at all. A knot of poison hidden in a dead woman's hair, we left it. A small, concealed object carrying the weight of an entire unresolved conspiracy. Rome, it turns out, produced no shortage of men skilled at concealment of a different kind. Not poison hidden in a knot of hair, but ambition hidden in a will, in a friendship, in the careful cultivation of a dying man's trust. Few practiced this particular art with more calculated skill, or drew more contempt from his contemporaries, than a lawyer named Marcus Aquillius Regulus. Regulus rose to prominence during the reigns of Nero, Vespasian, and Domitian, and he built his considerable fortune not through provincial governorship or military command, but through a specific and, to many educated Romans, deeply unsettling profession. He made himself indispensable to the wealthy and the dying, positioning himself as a trusted friend and advisor in their final months, and emerging with striking regularity as a named beneficiary in their wills. Our clearest window into Regulus comes from Pliny the Younger, the senator and letter writer whose correspondence survives as one of our richest sources for daily life and personal reputation in this period of Roman history. Pliny detested Regulus, and his letters describing him crackle with a personal animosity unusual even by the standards of Roman rhetorical rivalry. According to Pliny, Regulus had built an entire career during Nero's reign as one of the era's feared prosecutors, participating in trials that led to the deaths or ruin of several prominent senators, a history that should, by any reasonable measure, have permanently disqualified him from respectable public life once Nero's regime finally collapsed. Instead, Regulus adapted, reinvented himself, and continued accumulating wealth and influence under each subsequent emperor with what Pliny describes as shameless, almost theatrical opportunism. It is the specific pattern of his later career, though, that makes Regulus such a genuinely strange figure to examine. Pliny recounts with evident disgust multiple instances of Regulus attaching himself to wealthy, elderly, or terminally ill Romans, offering flattery, attention, and apparent devotion during their final illness, and being rewarded upon their deaths with substantial legacies. In one letter, Pliny describes Regulus visiting a dying woman named Verenia, feigning interest in astrology to gain her confidence, consulting supposed experts about the timing of her death, and offering false reassurances of her recovery, behavior Pliny frames as calculated cruelty disguised as concern, designed purely to secure a place in her will before she could reconsider it. How much of this portrait reflects documented, verifiable behavior, and how much reflects the particular literary vendetta Pliny appears to have nursed against a man who represented, in his letters, everything he found distasteful about Rome's changing political culture? This is where the mainstream account grows genuinely difficult to assess. Pliny was not a neutral observer. He explicitly positions himself throughout his letters as Regulus's moral opposite, a senator of old-fashioned integrity confronting the empire's new breed of opportunist. Ancient Rome's culture of personal correspondence, much like its courtroom oratory, permitted, even encouraged, a level of character assault that modern readers might reasonably question as evidence. Yet Pliny's accounts are detailed, specific, named, and dated with a consistency that has led most modern historians to accept the broad outline of Regulus's legacy hunting career as substantially accurate, even while acknowledging the hostile lens through which it comes to us. What remains genuinely unresolved is the scale of it. Pliny suggests, almost in passing, that Regulus's fortune from these bequests grew large enough to be remarked upon throughout Roman society, yet no independent financial record survives to confirm the actual sums involved, or how many separate wills ultimately named him. We are left estimating the true scope of an operation we can only see through the outraged testimony of a single rival, describing incidents that, however vivid, represent only the cases Pliny personally witnessed or heard reported. There is also the deeper, stranger question of Regulus's own psychology, one that Pliny's letters gesture toward without ever fully answering. What kind of man builds an entire late-life reputation around the deliberate, patient cultivation of dying strangers' trust? Was this simple, uncomplicated greed, pursued without any deeper design, or something closer to a genuine skill, a talent for intimacy and persuasion turned entirely toward personal gain, practiced by a man who understood, perhaps better than most of his contemporaries, exactly what the isolated and the dying needed to hear? Pliny records that Regulus died sometime after 105 AD, apparently still wealthy, still respected in certain circles despite his reputation, having faced no formal legal consequence for a career built so visibly on exploiting the vulnerable. Did Regulus ever privately reckon with what his contemporaries so openly condemned him for, or did he genuinely believe, until the end, that he had simply mastered a skill others lacked the nerve to practice? And how many wills, how many dying rooms, how many quiet conversations at bedsides across the Roman world never made it into Pliny's letters at all, lost now to us entirely? Somewhere beneath the outrage of a single hostile correspondent, the true extent of Marcus Aquillius Regulus's long career remains, even now, only partially illuminated. A century would pass between the quiet cruelty of a legacy hunter working Rome's sick rooms and the arrival of a very different kind of feared man, one whose menace announced itself not through whispered flattery at a deathbed, but through sheer physical presence. On the northern frontier, where the empire's soldiers, not its senators, now decided who would wear the purple. His name, as recorded by history, was Gaius Julius Verres Maximinus, known to us as Maximinus Thrax, the Thracian, and he stands as one of the most physically imposing and politically unprecedented figures ever to claim the Roman throne. Where every emperor before him, however humble their family's earlier standing, had at minimum passed through the Senate's ranks, held magistracies, accumulated the customary credentials of Roman public life, Maximinus arrived at supreme power in 235 AD, having done none of it. He was, by the account of our sources, a career soldier of provincial birth, likely from Thrace or the surrounding region, who rose entirely through the military ranks, the first Roman emperor in history never to have set foot in the Senate before claiming its ultimate authority to command it. The scale of the man himself became, almost immediately, central to how contemporaries and later historians described him. The Historia Augusta, a collection of imperial biographies whose reliability modern historians treat with considerable and often justified skepticism, records claims of Maximinus's height reaching genuinely extraordinary figures. Some ancient measurements translating to well over 8 feet, a size so far beyond ordinary human proportion that most scholars today dismiss the specific numbers as legend rather than measurement. Yet, even accounting for exaggeration, the consistency across multiple ancient sources describing him as a man of unusual and imposing physical stature suggests something real sat beneath the myth. A soldier whose sheer presence on the battlefield, whatever his exact height, became part of the story Rome told itself about how such a man could seize its highest office. What we can trace with more confidence is the mechanism of his rise. In 235 AD, while serving as a senior military commander under the young emperor Alexander Severus during a campaign against Germanic tribes along the Rhine frontier, Maximinus was proclaimed emperor by his own troops. A mutiny effectively born from the soldiers' dissatisfaction with Alexander Severus's leadership and his apparent preference for negotiation over direct military confrontation. Alexander Severus was killed shortly afterward, reportedly by the same mutinous soldiers, and Maximinus found himself, almost without warning, ruler of the Roman world, still on campaign, having never so much as visited the capital he now nominally governed. This is where his reign becomes genuinely difficult territory for historians, because Maximinus's 3 years in power were defined, in the surviving sources, almost entirely by conflict, both against Rome's external enemies and increasingly against his own subjects. He continued campaigning aggressively against Germanic tribes along the frontier, extending Roman control and winning military victories that our sources, even hostile ones, acknowledge as genuinely significant. But his relationship with Rome's traditional governing class deteriorated with striking speed. He never traveled to the capital during his entire reign, ruling instead from military camps on the frontier, an absence that struck the Senate and Roman public as an implicit statement about where his loyalties and interests truly lay, and one that only deepened the sense of a man ruling as an outsider, indifferent to the institutions and rituals that had legitimized every emperor before him. The financial demands of continuous frontier warfare, meanwhile, required revenue. Maximinus extracted through means our sources describe as increasingly harsh: heavy taxation, the confiscation of temple treasuries, and public funds previously reserved for civic purposes, measures that alienated not just the senatorial elite but broader segments of the Roman population who had, under most previous emperors, remained largely insulated from imperial politics. By 238 AD, a year later, remembered by historians as the Year of the Six Emperors for its sheer accumulated chaos, rebellion had spread from North Africa to Rome itself, with the Senate formally declaring Maximinus a public enemy and backing a series of rival claimants to the throne in rapid succession. Maximinus responded by marching his army toward Italy, laying siege to the city of Aquileia in the empire's northeast, a siege our sources describe as prolonged and increasingly desperate, the city's defenders holding out against Maximinus's forces far longer than anticipated. It was here, outside walls he could not breach, that his reign finally collapsed. Not through defeat in battle, but through mutiny within his own camp. In May of 238 AD, frustrated soldiers, reportedly incited by officers within the Praetorian Guard accompanying him, entered his tent and killed him along with his son, presenting their heads to the Senate as proof the crisis had ended. It is worth pausing on how strange this entire trajectory truly is, and how much of it remains genuinely contested by historians studying the period. Maximinus represents, by most conventional readings, the moment Roman imperial power became explicitly and undeniably a function of military loyalty rather than senatorial legitimacy or dynastic inheritance. The crisis of the 3rd century beginning, in many historical accounts, precisely with his unprecedented rise. But was Maximinus truly the uniquely brutal and unpopular figure our surviving sources, chiefly senatorial in origin and hostile to a man who had bypassed their class entirely, present him as? The Historia. Augusta, in particular, our most detailed source for his personal character and habits, is regarded by modern scholars as deeply unreliable in its specifics, likely composed generations after the events it describes and prone to fabrication, exaggeration, and outright invention presented as documented fact. How much of the barbarian giant image, the extraordinary height, the reported cruelty, the characterization as scarcely civilized, reflects a genuine contemporary reputation, and how much reflects a senatorial class constructing, after the fact, the most damning possible portrait of a man who had shown their institution open contempt? There is also the deeper, unresolved question of what Maximinus's reign actually represented in the longer arc of Roman history. Was he simply an aberration, a soldier who seized an opportunity chaos handed him and proved unable to translate military success into political survival? Or was he the first clear signal of a structural shift already underway within the empire? Evidence that the loyalty of frontier legions had quietly become more decisive to imperial power than any endorsement Rome's traditional institutions could offer. A shift that would define and destabilize the Roman world for decades afterward. His severed head, carried to Rome as proof of a crisis resolved, may have answered the immediate question of who would rule. Whether it answered anything about what Roman power had already, irreversibly become, is a question the sources leave only partially addressed. A soldier emperor whose true face, buried beneath legend and hostile testimony alike, the historical record has never fully allowed us to see clearly. A severed head, presented to the Senate as proof that a crisis had ended. We left it there. A grim exhibit meant to close one chapter of instability. Nearly 3 centuries earlier, that same chamber had faced a different kind of proof problem entirely. Not evidence that a threat had been eliminated, but evidence, gathered piece by piece, that a threat existed at all, aimed at the Senate's own members, from within their own ranks. The man at the center of this earlier crisis was Lucius Sergius Catilina, remembered to history simply as Catiline, and his name has become, in the 2,000 years since his death, virtually synonymous with conspiracy itself. Born into an old patrician family that had, by his lifetime, lost much of its former wealth and prominence, Catiline pursued a political career marked by ambition, frequently outpacing opportunity, twice standing for the consulship, Rome's highest elected office, and twice failing accusations of bribery and corruption, trailing him through both attempts. It was his second defeat in the elections for 63 BC that set in motion the events for which he is remembered. According to our primary sources, chiefly Cicero, who won that same consular election and would become Catiline's principal antagonist, along with the historian Sallust, writing a generation later. Catiline responded to this political failure by assembling a conspiracy aimed at nothing less than seizing power in Rome through armed uprising, beginning with the assassination of the newly elected consuls, Cicero among them, and the burning of the city itself as cover for a broader seizure of government. The alleged conspiracy drew support, our sources tell us, from a genuinely diverse coalition of Roman society's discontented, impoverished former soldiers of the dictator Sulla, who had never fully re-established themselves financially after his proscriptions decades earlier, indebted aristocrats facing financial ruin, and various others for whom the existing political order offered little remaining hope of advancement. Catiline himself, according to Sallust's famous and often quoted characterization, possessed a nature capable of enduring hunger, cold, and sleeplessness beyond ordinary human tolerance. A portrait that renders him almost superhuman in his capacity for the very ambition that would destroy him. Though we should note, as we have with so many figures in this history, that Sallust was writing with clear moral purpose, using Catiline's story to illustrate broader anxieties about the Republic's decline. Cicero's response to the unfolding threat produced some of the most famous oratory to survive from the ancient world. His 4 speeches against Catiline, delivered before the Senate, which open with the now legendary rhetorical question demanding to know how much longer Catiline intended to abuse the Senate's patience. These speeches present Cicero's case against the conspiracy in vivid, escalating detail, culminating in his claim to have obtained physical evidence. Letters allegedly written by conspirators to the Allobroges, a Gallic tribe whose support Catiline's associates had apparently sought, intercepted before they could be delivered and presented before the Senate as undeniable proof of treasonous intent. It is precisely here, at the moment of Cicero's triumphant unveiling of evidence, that modern historians have found the most room for genuine uncertainty. Cicero was, by his own admission and by the structure of his surviving speeches, both prosecutor and principal beneficiary of the conspiracy's exposure. A consul whose reputation and legacy became permanently entwined with having saved the Republic from destruction. This does not mean the conspiracy was invented. Sallust, writing with considerably more distance from the events and generally regarded as a more independent witness, corroborates the broad outline of an actual armed plot, and the eventual military engagement against Catiline's forces near Pistoria in January of 62 BC, where Catiline died fighting rather than fleeing, argues against the theory that this was purely a political fabrication. But how much of the conspiracy's scale and organization, as Cicero presented it to the Senate in the heat of the moment, reflects the actual coordinated threat it was described as, and how much reflects the natural tendency of a man defending his own political survival to present the danger he'd narrowly averted in the most dramatic possible terms. The controversy deepened considerably in the conspiracy's immediate aftermath, when Cicero, acting on the Senate's authority, ordered the execution of 5 captured conspirators without formal trial, a decision defensible, in Cicero's own framing, as an emergency measure against active treason, but one that Roman law technically required be subject to appeal before the full citizen body. This action would follow Cicero for the remainder of his career. His political enemies, Clodius, Pulcher, prominent among them, would later use the illegality of these executions as grounds to drive Cicero into exile, arguing that whatever threat Catiline posed, the response to it had itself violated the Republic's foundational legal protections. Was Cicero's swift, extrajudicial action a necessary defense of the state against genuine and immediate danger? Or did it represent an early and troubling precedent, a Roman consul, however celebrated in the moment, deciding unilaterally that the normal protections of citizenship could be suspended when sufficiently alarming evidence was presented, evidence that only he had fully verified? There is a further question that continues to occupy historians examining this episode. How genuinely close did Catiline's conspiracy come to succeeding? Sallust's account suggests a plot with real logistical substance, stockpiled weapons, coordinated regional support, a specific timeline for action. Yet the conspiracy collapsed with remarkable speed once exposed, its supposed network of support in Rome itself apparently dissolving almost the moment Cicero's speeches turned public opinion decisively against it, raising the possibility that its scale was considerably more modest, and its chances of actual success considerably more remote than the surviving sources, invested as they were in dramatizing the danger, chose to present. What, in the end, are we left with regarding Lucius Sergius Catilina? A genuine revolutionary, prepared to burn Rome to escape the political failure that had twice denied him its highest office, or a desperate, marginalized aristocrat whose actual capacity for harm was magnified considerably by a consul who needed, for his own legacy and survival, to have averted something extraordinary. Somewhere between the intercepted letters read aloud in the Senate and the battlefield at Pistoria, where Catiline chose death over capture, the true shape and scale of Rome's most famous conspiracy remains, even now, a subject historians continue turning over, searching for what Cicero's triumphant narrative may have left conveniently unexamined. The question we left suspended over Catiline's conspiracy: how much of a presented threat reflects genuine danger, and how much reflects the needs of the man presenting it, found no more fertile ground in Roman history than in the professional culture of accusation that flourished under the early emperors. We touched briefly in examining Livineius Regulus on the career of a man who came to define that culture more thoroughly than almost anyone else of his era. It is time now to look at him directly. His name was Publius Suilius Rufus, and by the time of his eventual downfall, he had built a reputation so thoroughly entwined with the practice of prosecution for profit that Tacitus, our principal source for his career, treats his fall as something of a moral reckoning for an entire corrupted system, not merely the punishment of a single man. Suilius rose to prominence under the Emperor Clodius, whose reign, our sources suggest, proved particularly hospitable to the delators, those professional accusers who built careers and fortunes bringing charges, frequently of treason, against wealthy or politically inconvenient Romans, collecting a share of the condemned's confiscated property when their prosecution succeeded. What distinguished Suilius, according to Tacitus, was less the practice itself, which by this point in imperial history had become disturbingly routine, than the sheer scale and brazenness with which he pursued it. He is described as having accumulated an extraordinary personal fortune through decades of prosecution work, becoming, by some ancient estimates, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, through fees and confiscated property gained by testifying against or securing the conviction of his fellow citizens. Tacitus records a particularly striking detail: that Suilius openly defended the practice of accepting payment for advocacy, arguing before the Senate that lawyers of earlier, more idealized Roman generations had simply concealed their fees rather than genuinely refusing them, a defense that reads even now as a man daring his accusers to prove they were any different from him, merely more discreet. This raises a genuine question worth sitting with. Was Suilius uniquely corrupt among his generation, or simply uniquely honest about a corruption that pervaded the entire system of Roman advocacy and prosecution by this period? Tacitus clearly intends the former reading, presenting Suilius as a particularly egregious symbol of imperial decay. But the specific defense Tacitus records him offering, that concealment, not restraint, was the only real difference between himself and earlier generations of Roman lawyers, suggests a man who understood, with unsettling clarity, exactly how the system around him actually functioned, whatever public morality claimed about it. Suilius's career included prosecutions against several prominent Romans, but perhaps the case most frequently cited by later historians involves the philosopher and statesman Seneca, whom Suilius attacked in the Senate in 58 AD, accusing him of hypocrisy. Amassing an enormous personal fortune, Suilius charged, while publicly preaching Stoic philosophy's disdain for material wealth, and of improperly profiting from money-lending in the province of Britain under exploitative terms. The accusation is fascinating precisely because of its ambiguous motives. Was Suilius genuinely exposing a real contradiction in Seneca's public and private conduct, using tactics no more corrupt than the norm of his profession? Or was this a calculated act of political self-preservation, an attempt to discredit a man whose growing influence at court, following Nero's rise to the throne, posed an increasing threat to Suilius's own position? Modern historians studying Seneca's actual finances have found the underlying charges genuinely difficult to dismiss entirely. Seneca's wealth by this period was indeed remarkable, and the money-lending accusations in Britain align with other evidence suggesting Roman financial practices there contributed to local unrest. The accusation, however self-serving its source, may have contained real substance. Tacitus's hostility toward Suilius makes easy to overlook. Suilius's fall came in 58 AD in a Senate now increasingly under Seneca's own influence as Nero's advisor, timing that itself invites scrutiny. Charged with a lifetime of corrupt prosecutions and extortion, Suilius was convicted and exiled to the Balearic Islands, his considerable fortune partially confiscated, though our sources note that a portion was preserved for his children, a detail suggesting even his prosecutors recognized limits to how thoroughly a man of his former standing could be stripped bare. Tacitus reports that Suilius met his condemnation not with submission, but with continued, almost theatrical defiance, reportedly remaining unrepentant and combative even as the Senate delivered its judgment against him. A final gesture entirely consistent with a man who had built his entire career on the conviction that everyone around him operated by the same rules he simply refused to hide. Here, the historical record grows genuinely thin. What became of Suilius Rufus in his island exile? How long he lived afterward? Whether he died in obscurity or continued in whatever manner exile permitted to maintain some version of the defiance Tacitus records at his trial, none of this survives in any source we possess. A man whose name had been, for decades, synonymous with Rome's machinery of accusation simply exits the historical stage the moment that machinery finally turned against him, exiting as abruptly and completely as Chrysogonus, Regulus, and so many others in this history who once wielded prosecution as their instrument of power. There is, finally, a question worth asking about the entire system Suilius represents, one that extends well beyond his individual case. If the practice of professional accusation was as pervasive as Tacitus suggests, if lawyers across Rome genuinely did accept fees while publicly denying it, as Suilius' own defense implied, then how many prosecutions across this era, celebrated or condemned by history, actually reflected genuine pursuit of justice, and how many reflected simply a more carefully concealed version of exactly what destroyed him? Suilius's unusual honesty about his own corruption may be the most genuinely revealing thing about him. Not that he was uniquely guilty, but that he refused, until the very end, to pretend he wasn't simply better at hiding it than everyone judging him. Somewhere in that refusal, and in the silence that swallowed him afterward, sits an uncomfortable question about how much of Rome's celebrated system of justice actually deserved the name.